Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mayor of Athens, Mr. Brad Smith, welcome to the Aristotle Address. This is the 8th year we're gathering for the Athens Democracy Forum, but the first time that we are unable to convene in the hallowed ancient agora, where our Greek forebears first shaped the idea of the rule by the people. Still, speaking with you today with the majestic Stoa Vatalos as a backdrop, I find it a bit more difficult to complain about what we are going through today. How many triumphs and tragedies those majestic stones have witnessed over the ages. How many anguished disputes in times of plague, war, and despotism. Yet, at the end of the day, wisdom and reason always reclaim their place of honor. This is not an argument for surrender or passivity, even though we must point out that what is very, very different today compared to any other point of our known history is the existential threat that climate change presents. As cognizant we are of this, it is nevertheless a reminder that even in times like these, when we need to stay far apart from each other, when brute force and intolerance seem to be on the ascent, when our very planet is threatened by our greed and blindness, even in times like these, the human spirit can and will prevail. The great philosophers who sat among those timeless Athenian columns were certain, in the words of Pericles, that time is the wisest counselor of all. What we are living through is not an aberration. The new abnormal that is the theme of our forum is the norm, the one constant through the ages. To quote another Grecian sage, Heraclitus, and I quote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he is not the same man." To Heraclitus, continual change was the way of the world, while resisting change, clinging to what is known and safe, was unnatural. That is the message of our theme, and that is the message of the Athenian agora. Let's not despair, however gloomy the world may seem, because time is on our side. The ancient agora seems to cast its spell even from a distance, but it's a wonderful and creative spell, and I welcome you all to today's discussions, which I trust will meet the high standard of the many that have taken place among these stones over the ages. I would like to thank our headline sponsor, Facebook, and it is much appreciated that in such a volatile year we have many supporters that believe in the mission of the Athens Democracy Forum. And there are other levels of sponsorship where we have Microsoft, EBRD, Google, the Council of Europe, Greek National Tourism Organization, Aegean Airlines, OTES, Solidarity Now, Libra Group, and the National Bank of Greece. Above all, I would like to thank the New York Times and Stephen Dunbar Johnson, the President International of the New York Times Company, in whose place I'm actually delivering these welcome remarks, as he was not able to make it in person due to the COVID-19 regulations. But he's here virtually. And Stephen, thank you for your support. As most of you know, this conference was founded 8 years ago at the New York Times, and it is testament to that institution's foresight that they allowed it to evolve under this non-profit structure, the Democracy and Culture Foundation, which stays closely with the Timesian sensibility, but as an independent entity, can focus more on the do part of our think, talk, do impact chain for the attainment of our two outcomes, citizen engagement and better governance. Mayor Bakoyannis and the City of Athens remain faithful stakeholders of this endeavour, as do the Kofi Annan Foundation, given that the United Nations Secretary General was a major inspiration for this forum. But the highlight of this evening is the Aristotle Address, which has become a staple of the Athens Democracy Forum, usually delivered by a head of state. But this year, we've decided to shake things up a little bit and invited one of the foremost leaders in the private sector, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft. He may even share with us how Aristotle would have dealt with cloud computing and technology. Brad will respond to what Aristotle said some 2,500 years ago, just around the corner from here. And I quote, "If liberty and equality, as is thought by some, are chiefly to be found in democracy, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in government to the utmost." I hope to see you all in Athens in a year from now, hopefully in person, at the ancient Agora and in a safer and better world of a new normal. But before Aristotle comes on stage, let us hear first from another ancient Greek, the successor of Pericles, Mayor Kostas Bakoyannis. Mr. Mayor, thank you for your support, your vision, your can-do spirit, which is so important for our foundation too, and for hosting us in this beautiful and inspiring city of Athens. Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Achilles. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not only an honor, it is actually a distinct pleasure, a great pleasure, to welcome you, even from afar, to Athens. A special thanks to my friend, Achilles Tsaltas, and the entire team of the Athens Democracy Forum for bringing us all together at an annual gathering that over the years has become an institution. And the timing of this event is as pertinent as ever. Today, we stand not only in the face of an unprecedented pandemic, but also of a financial crisis. With disenchantment in globalization, trust in institutions at a low point, social media confusing facts with fiction and even prejudice, nationalism's reawakening, populism spreading, radicalism rising its ugly head, authoritarianism unfortunately re-emerging. History, after all, not only the history of ancient Athens, but the history of the whole world, actually teaches us that crises such as these can awaken both our best and our worst selves. And allow me to say that Athens, being the birthplace of democracy, is the ideal setting for this forum. Ladies and gentlemen, in full disclosure, the pandemic came at a cruel time for the city of Athens. Just as the city was emerging from a decade of an unprecedented economic crisis. And yet, however paradoxical it may sound, we remain optimistic. Not only because since the beginning, since day one of the pandemic, we prioritized facts, science, truth, transparency over and above politics and partisanship, but also because a new managerial approach emerged, harnessing the crisis for much needed reforms. Indeed, the pandemic has been a real catalyst, both on a city and on a national level. Now, of course, there is much to do and there is much that remains to be done. And much will depend on whether we actually opt to bounce back or to bounce forward. In this context, I often ask myself, how will history remember 2020? Is it a public health crisis with unforeseen economic and social consequences, or is it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? I would suggest that the answer lies in the job description we assign to ourselves. Make no mistake, we cannot return to normal. There is no back to normal. Because this is not merely about crisis management. This is not merely, however significant, about another challenge in public administration. And that's because the very essence of democracy is at stake. Now, there is no point whatsoever in sermons. There is no point in lamenting about a paradise lost, about an idealized state of democracy that we all know never really existed. After all, admittedly, democracy is an imperfect system of governance. Indeed, I think many of us remember the famous Winston Churchill saying of 1947 that democracy is the worst form of government except for all other forms that have been tried from time to time. But I think most of us actually forget another quote of Winston Churchill. In 1944, in the midst of war, he said that at the bottom of all the tributes paid to democracy is the little man walking into the little booth with a little pencil, making a little cross on a little bit of paper. No amount of rhetoric or discussion can possibly diminish the overwhelming importance of that point. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, democracy is probably the grandest and most expensive fail-safe constructed in human history. It's constructed to guard and to protect the weakest amongst us. It is a testament to humanity's endless capacity and will for solidarity. Yet, somewhere along the way, we have taken democracy for granted and moved on. And as a result, a growing sense of unease settles amongst many of us. There is no easy answer. But one thing is clear. Democracy is linked with debate, with often than not vigorous, robust, and forceful engagement and pushback. And we need more of that, not less. But the terms of the debate have changed, and language matters. Arrogant condensation is the worst recipe. Simply hurling epithets at those who disagree with us is not good enough. And fear-mongering does not work. And one cannot preach to someone who has no food on his or her plate how to hold a knife or a fork. We need a new and inclusive agenda, a positive agenda that leaves no one behind, especially those who feel disenchanted and even despised. In other words, politics is about meaning, and it's about self-worth. And this is particularly true in the era of social media. And it's extremely important that we engage everyone, especially the young, those millennials whose technological identity and precarious working conditions make them feel disenfranchised and require a different commitment. So if I were to sum up, I would sum up in 4 words. I would say shut up and listen. Or in one word, humility. Listen to the people. The world, after all, has turned upside down. And now it is my great honor to welcome the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, to the floor to give the Aristotle Address. It is democracy, it is the future, visiting its birthplace. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Well, I first want to say what an honor it is to follow the mayor and what a pleasure it is for me to be here physically in Athens and virtually with all of you around the world. I think this is a moment in time that calls on us from around the world to come to Athens, either physically or virtually, to take stock of the state of democracy. One of my favorite publications every year comes from The Economist. It's its annual review of the world's democracies. What it has shown this year, as in other recent years, is that we live in some ways in an extraordinary time. There are 3.7 billion people on this planet who live in the 76 nations that are classified as democracies. We might think that this is a moment to celebrate. Never in human history have so many people benefited from democratic rights at the same time. But I did not come to Athens to celebrate democracy, as important as I believe that is to do. I came to Athens because I think this is a moment in time when we need to talk seriously about the threats to technology that technology is creating for the health of democracy around the world. Only if we take stock of these new threats can we take the steps that will be needed to put technology to work to preserve and protect democracy's future. I think it's an imperative that we start by talking about the problems we need to solve. In my view, these problems fall into three categories. The first is really the new threats to individual rights that are being created by use of technology. If there was a defining feature of democracy in the time of Aristotle, it was the supreme role of the individual. After all, this was not a republic in Athens, it was a genuine democracy. Every individual played a role. Our world is very different. Our polities are much larger, but the role of the individual is still at the heart of democracy itself. It is at the heart of people's ability to decide what to say and then to say it. It is at the heart of the ability of people to come together in free assembly and sometimes peaceful protest to make their views known to their community. And yet today we see technology creating new threats. We see the potential for facial recognition being used to chill the rights of people to protest peacefully or to assemble and express their views. We see massive government surveillance put at risk the ability of people to formulate their views and to share them with others in private. This is the first problem we need to think hard about. There's a second. Democracy, including in ancient Athenian times, depended on people having access to information. And in a world today where people cannot come together and all listen to a speaker in one moment, we rely critically not just on technology and the internet, but on a free press. So far, this century has not been kind to the health of the free press. In the United States, between 2004 and 2018, over 14 years, we saw the number of people paid in journalism fall by 47%. In other words, it was cut in half. And increasingly in the United States, we are talking about deserts that are not the result of climate change, but because of a lack of money going into journalism. We're seeing news deserts where communities no longer have a newspaper at all. What has this got to do with technology? It has a lot to do with technology. Because what we fundamentally saw was new models for dissemination of media, including social media, new models for searching and selling goods erode traditional revenue streams, including classified ads, and journalism has not yet recovered. Finally, we're seeing an enormous and critical range of new threats to our democratic processes. And these fall, I think, into three categories. The first is the use of technology to attack the people who run for office, the people who serve in office, the people who come together in think tanks to analyze what's going on with people in office. That burst into the headlines in 2016. It is continuing to get worse 4 years later. Just last month, we at Microsoft published a new study, and what it showed was that we had seen a nation-state related group in Russia attack 200 different individuals and organizations associated with our democracy in the United States. As we stated, we had also seen a group located in China succeed with nearly 150 compromises of individuals associated with our political process. And we've seen a rapid increase in attacks coming from a group in Iran, a group that so far has created 155 different fake domains that we've been able to take down in order to stop its bad actions. And what we are seeing at Microsoft is being witnessed by others across the industry, as you heard from Facebook just earlier today. This is a critical problem we need to address. But then, of course, there's in some ways an even broader problem. It's the issue of disinformation and sometimes misinformation on social media. In so many ways, what we have found is, frankly, individuals associated with the state in Russia weaponize social media. In fact, I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves is whether the Russian military, over the history of the Soviet Union, ever developed a single aircraft that did as much damage to the United States of America as Russian attacks on social media platforms have done in the United States over the last 4 years. And of course, what we saw first arise as an attack from the outside is increasingly being used by others who are emulating these practices with the threat of corroding and eroding democracy from within. We have to think hard about how we can have a healthy social media sector in the future and protect democracy at the same time. And finally, there is perhaps the most dangerous problem of all, the threat to our very voting. That is, of course, at the end of the day, the most critical essence of democracy itself. What would we do as a state, a nation, or the world if there were a day when we woke up and found that the votes that had been counted had actually not been cast? What would we do if our voting rolls are tampered with by a foreign power? What would we do if the votes themselves are altered or if the process to tabulate them were disrupted? This is not the kind of risk that a democracy can afford to run. It is the kind of threat we need to get up every morning and take new steps to address. So what do we do? Well, I think we need to start by recognizing the seriousness of these problems, and then we need to take new steps together. I think these steps need to begin with new guardrails around technology. Guardrails in times under the law itself. Guardrails like the one passed in Washington State that's now being considered in Brussels that would, say, ban the use of facial recognition to surveil people engaged in peaceful protests. We need to have guardrails in place against the use of technology to surveil people. We need to have guardrails in place around social media. We especially need to think about the role of political advertising on social media. We need to take care to ensure that we're not just putting Band-Aids on a patient that is dying of cancer. We have to ask ourselves fundamentally, is something like political advertising on social media good or bad for democracy? If it is fundamentally proving to be bad for democracy, then we need to ask ourselves, can it be reformed or should it be eliminated? Because there are companies that every day prohibit political advertising on their platforms, even while there are others that profit from it. These are the real conversations we need to have as an industry. In addition to adding new technology guardrails, we need to strengthen our technology defenses. This, in some ways, every day needs to start with the technology sector itself. And it's heartening to see the broadening progress. It's encouraging to see the new steps at Facebook, the new steps at Google, the new steps across our industry to harden technology defenses against these attacks from foreign adversaries. The good news about 2020 is that this problem is no longer hidden from view. We now understand it, we talk about it, and we take steps to address it. But our work is not done, and we need to recognize that our work never will be done. Because this has become the next era of technology cat and mouse. Every time we strengthen our defenses, the tactics to use technology to attack democracy will evolve, and we will need to evolve with it. Third, we need to pursue new models to support a healthy and free press. We have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Do we need a free press that is healthy? And I say the answer fundamentally must be yes. We need a broadly informed electorate. And then we need to ask ourselves, if the free market is not creating this today, what are we prepared to do to step in? What are we prepared to do to create new models that will share revenue with media enterprises? What are we prepared to do to consider forms of public support? At the end of the day, this is not, in my view, an area where we can afford to be penny wise and pound foolish, waking up one day to find that we've all lost out, because literally, we're increasingly all living in a world with more and more news deserts. Fourth, we need new international norms. New international norms advanced by the world's democracies to protect the world's democracies. We need, as we have said before, the kinds of norms that will ensure that governments cannot, with impunity, attack each other's electoral systems. We need to recognize, as we did when we all came together as a community in the Paris Call, that this is the new norm that we need for the third decade of the 21st century. And we need to build on it. And we need to create, as we move forward, the equivalent of a digital Geneva Convention, the kind of clarity that will establish under an international law that governments are not permitted to attack the civilian infrastructure of other countries, just as they are not allowed to attack civilians in a time of war. Finally, perhaps most importantly, we need the world's democracies to come together. We need the multilateral defense of cyberspace above the world's democracies in much the same way we recognized after World War II that we needed an alliance across the Atlantic to protect the democracies that were recovering from the Second World War. There are times when this will require new deterrent doctrines, and some of these will be unilateral in nature, as they should be. But more often, we need the collective defense and the multilateral defense of the world to move forward. We need to do so in a manner that recognizes that in the 21st century, multilateralism requires multi-stakeholderism. It requires a partnership between governments and tech companies and other businesses and the great organizations that constitute civil society around the world. In closing, I would say that perhaps the most important thing that we should recognize is that democracy is a fragile thing. If there's one thing that we should remember from ancient Athens, it's that the great democratic era of this city-state lasted for less than 2 centuries. And each time other places around the world have sought to build on that democratic tradition, they too have had to confront enormous threats. The Republic in Rome did not survive forever. This decade will see the 250th anniversary of democracy in the United States. We cannot take democracy for granted. We should come to Athens, the cradle of democracy, to recognize together that only by working together will we ensure that democracy has a sustained and bright future. Thank you very much.